Coming up tonight, State Representative and new Assistant Majority Leader Joseph Wagner.
The Senate wanted to do all four.
Right.
And the difference between the proposals was on the order of $1 to $1.5 billion. Difference. Taxes are always a last resort, but I haven't heard anyone in the leadership in either branch say no.
Is there anyone in Chicopee asking you if you were interested in running for mayor? Would you be interested in running for mayor after 28 years of going up and down that pike to Boston? All that and more next on The State We're In, Connecting Point's weekly look at politics.
Support for Connecting Point is provided by our contributing viewers.
Good evening and welcome to The State We're In, Connecting Point's weekly look at politics. I'm Ray Herschel, in for Carrie Saldo. With many new faces and significant turnover in legislative seats from the region during this past election cycle, Democratic State Representative Joe Wagner of Chicopee is the only Western Massachusetts lawmaker to hold a top position in leadership this session. House Speaker Robert DeLeo has appointed Wagner to be Assistant Majority Leader, and I sat down with Representative Wagner to talk about his new role and what it means for the region in this week's edition of The State We're In.
I don't get too excited about very much of this. I take it very seriously, but I don't, I'm not over the top, But this one was pretty exciting, and I think it's beyond, for me personally, being an honor. I think for Chicopee and the district I represent, it's significant, and I hope for this region and in my work with my colleagues that it's significant. And so I guess that's a segue to an answer to your question, which is that, I'll have an opportunity. I think my voice will have more weight in the room. So I've actually been in the leadership under three different speakers and going back the better part of 20 years or just about 20 years now. And so I didn't, the fact that I was elevated to the fourth ranking member, while it was an honor, I still had the same seat in the room that I've had for the better part of 20 years. And while I understood that, I don't think people looking at it necessarily did. So I didn't anticipate the optic on the part of others looking at it. And so, so I hold with great regard the trust, that the Speaker and my colleagues, by their ratification vote, have put in me. So most immediately, I work with the Speaker even more closely on setting an agenda for the House across areas of policy. I certainly work with my colleagues here in Western Massachusetts. Many of them have been in talking about issues important to them, particularly the new representatives. Natalie Blaze, who replaced Steve Kulik, was in last week, and Mindy Dom from Amherst was in last week, and their districts are more rural than those representing my community of Chicopee, for example, or Springfield or Holyoke. But and so their issues can be different as well. So it's more it's a greater opportunity to, rather than specific committee work, to work across a broader range of policy and to network with members in an even different way to try and advance issues and causes important to them.
And that promotion comes at a time where there's somewhat of a political vacuum for the Western Mass delegation. As you alluded to just a second ago, a lot of seniority lost in the last year or so. We had retirements of John Syback, Steve Kulik, the unfortunate death of Peter Kokot, and the stepping down of Stan Rosenberg. I think I added the years up. It was something like 87 years of seniority, and that's a big blow to happen in such a short period of time. So what is the impact of that political vacuum now, and how do you get that seniority, get that clout back?
Well, I hope that Western Mass now having a seat atop the House leadership, whether it would be me or anyone else, I hope, offsets some of what we've lost. And if you look across our region, returning representatives have all gone up in ranks. So we have a number of, we have Buddy Williams and Carlos Gonzalez and Jose Tosado all being elevated to vice chairmanships, pretty good committees. 6 of the 20, or 6 or 7 of 24 members on the Committee on Ways and Means are from the 4 western counties. Now, there are 10 other counties in this Commonwealth, and the fact that 25% of the composition of that committee, and again, Buddy Williams and Jose Tosado and Carlos Gonzalez, I believe, are all in the Ways and Means Committee as well, as having gotten vice chairmanships. Mike Finn in West Springfield was elevated to the chairmanship of global warming oh gosh, it'll lose me, global warming and climate change.
Climate change,
yes. So, you know, we've seen, and there's an ebb and flow to this. When I came in some 28 years ago to the House of Representatives, I was the new person. You know, I was the new rep, and I was serving with Tony Schiavelli, who had been in the House for 41 or so years at that point, and Ray Jordan, who had been in the House for many, many years, and Paul Caron, and Bill Nagel from Northampton, who had been in for more than 20 years, and they were as senior as the people who, you know, have now left or have departed, and you know, in the case of Peter, unfortunately passing.
Right.
And so there's an ebb and flow to it, but it's okay.
I mean, I go back even before then. I can remember as a cub reporter covering David Bartley from Holyoke when he was House Speaker, Morris Donahue from Holyoke when he was Senate President. So the political clout goes back a long, long way. And it's going to be a challenging transition, I think.
And that's earned with years and seniority, but you've got to have more than years in seniority. And so if you look across this region and put me aside and look at some of the others who are elevated, it demonstrates their ability. Because you don't rise through the ranks just based on seniority or loyalty or things like that. You've got to demonstrate ability. You've got to wrap your arms around one or more areas of policy and roll up your shirt sleeves and really get about the work, while at the same time, attending to the needs of your constituents who are calling the office on a day in and day out basis.
Sure. How about this, the new freshman class, if you will? Natalie Blaze, Dan Carey, you mentioned, Mindy Daub, and Lindsay Sabadosa.
Yeah.
Have you had meetings with them? Have you given them advice?
I've had meetings with 2 of the 4, and I've been in settings, a number of settings with the other 2, the New Legislators Academy up at UMass back in early December before the new members were sworn. And all of those members that you mentioned, by the way, were put on significant committees. I wouldn't call them entry-level committees for the most part. I know that Natalie Blaze and Lindsay Sabados are both on the Joint Committee on Transportation. And there are years where you don't get one freshman on that committee. We not only have those 2, but they are from Western Massachusetts. That is significant. So, and each legislator has areas of interest or priority, and each of those new legislators that you mentioned received committee assignments that were consistent with their areas of interest.
So as Assistant Majority Leader, how do you decide which priorities will move forward, which will go before committee, which bills will be heard, when you're hearing from all the new legislators, veteran legislators in the Springfield area, different interests perhaps, but how do you determine in terms of priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and moving forward from there?
Well, so all the bills are heard. I mean, there are thousands of bills filed by House and Senate members, 200 legislators in total. And they are now in the process of being assigned to committees, and committees are just beginning the work of putting together agendas and grouping bills and beginning hearings. And some of those hearings will happen outside of Beacon Hill. I would expect that there would be some hearings in Western Massachusetts. I always took my committee on the road during the session in the 20 years that I chaired 3 different committees. And so, but we collaboratively, the Speaker listens to the members, and there are some issues that are front and center. A couple that we tried to find common ground on with the Senate last year. The House and Senate, we couldn't get there. Education was one, and health care was another, and we'll come back around on those. But so we know those are front burner. But when you talk about an issue like education, it may be different for me in Chicopee than it is for Lindsay Sabadosa in Northampton, than it is for Natalie Blaze in the 19 towns she represents in Western Mass.
Yeah, the devil is in the details, and in terms of funding for public education. I know it's a priority for Speaker DeLeo. It's a priority for the Senate President and Governor Baker, for that matter, in his budget outlined that. Where do you see the three coming together in terms of reaching common consensus? Does the education formula have to be changed?
It's stated. The legislature enacted into law an education reform bill in 1993, and it provided immediately for $700 million of new education funding, and then incremental increases over 6 additional years. And so we put a lot of money into education over now 25 or 6 years since we enacted education reform. But the budget is antiquated, and it doesn't take into consideration some things that have changed on the education landscape. And more of the dollars that we dedicate and communities dedicate toward public education are diverted to things that are not consistent with the way the structure existed. And let me drill down on it a little bit. There was a Foundation Budget Review Commission charged with looking at the foundation budget and determining what works, what may not be working, the reasons that may not be working, and what changes we might make. And so they came up back in 2015 with 4 recommendations, one of which was around health care and the significant costs and the imposition of a burden in relation to health care costs on school budgets. There are just so many dollars, and so we need to adjust the foundation budget to account for significant increases in health care costs, and in particular retiree costs. Communities traditionally have not budgeted for retiree costs. They budget pension costs, but they don't budget the increase in health care costs. So that's one area. Special education is another area. And the other 2 areas were English language learners and low-income students. And if I may, for just one more second, the House embraced reforms around the first 2 issues, health care costs and special education. The Senate wanted to do all 4.
Right.
And the difference between the proposals was on the order of $1 to $1.5 billion difference in cost between the House and Senate proposals. So we just didn't get there last session.
That's a key question, obviously. What is the cost going to be, and where will that money come from?
Well, so there's a narrative out there that I don't think accurately captures all that's in play on the issue. Those are great questions. So the cost, I think, can reasonably be assumed at somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion, and the thought was that, and without knowing an exact cost and without having reached final resolution on how many of those 4 areas we would tackle initially, the House staked out ground on 2, as I said, in the Senate all 4, and it was thought that the Fair Share Amendment that was struck down by the Massachusetts State Supreme Court and did not go to the ballot, the thought was that would provide more than $1 billion to help fund the education reforms that we're talking about. And when that question didn't go to the ballot, the narrative didn't change. But the answer is we're going to have to determine, and since there's a finite amount of money, Ray, we're either going to cut from other areas or talk about revenues.
My next follow-up question, obviously, does that mean new taxes would be seriously considered if you wanted to fully fund the education revision?
Well, I think taxes are always a last resort, but I haven't heard anyone in the leadership in either branch say no. The Speaker typically has staked out ground, at the beginning of a 2-year session, where he has said no to broad-based tax increases. He didn't do that this time around. I wouldn't read into that necessarily. And I think the answer goes to what it is we do. Will the House move off of the 2 that they were going to do, which comes at a much lower price tag, some of which could be absorbed? The governor proposes, by the way, that all of this would be incremental. So the governor proposes it over 6 to 7 years,
Right.
$200 million in new monies this year to foundation, and that's doable. Okay, and I don't. We're certainly not talking a broad-based tax increase. I think we can find the room for $200 million.
And how will this refunding formula help those communities that are underachieving? There's still big achievement gaps between affluent communities and poorer communities.
Yeah.
So how do you bring the poorer communities and the needy students up to the level in terms of the achievement gap with some of the more affluent communities?
So the two categories that the House didn't include initially, and which we had determined we would do as a second phase, and which the Senate wanted to get at, were the English language learners and the low-income districts or students, and there are increasingly more low-income districts, certainly in urban areas, and the English language learners. All of those things add costs that in the absence of finding out a way how to fund those added costs, are going to have that achievement gap that you talk about. So if it's low-income districts or English language learners, which are taking up increasingly bigger portions of budgets, in the absence of which we're just not getting the job done, you've got to funnel more money. And that brings into play the more affluent communities. So we're saying, well, we get that you want to funnel more money there, but we are already paying well above what foundation requires us to pay, and they feel they're being penalized by virtue of their being more affluent.
Now, in the House budget, is there additional money for some of the rural communities? I know there's been an outcry in some of the rural areas, particularly in far ends of western Massachusetts, about rural school districts who are seeing declining enrollment,
Yeah.
yet public transportation bus costs have gone up, and they're asking for more money to be able to continue their educational process.
Yeah, so the governor's Chapter 70 budget is up around, it goes from about $5.03 billion to just over $5.1 billion. So, an increase of some 60 to 70 $1 million. It may be slightly higher than that. That's from memory at this point. And in addition to money, he does do some things in relation to policy, some of which touches on rural districts with declining enrollments. The Secretary of Education, secondary ed, was in my office last week, and he made specific mention of rural school districts and the challenges that they face. And in some regional school districts, you have haves and have-nots. So he described a situation whereby in a regional school district where there might be a school here and a school over there, if the school in this community is thought to be better, students are finding their way to that school at the expense of the other school. So I don't recall, as you asked that question, what the governor has specifically, although I do know he has provisions that target rural school districts as part of his education reform package.
Yeah, sure, a complex issue, that's for sure. Want to get on to other issues in the budget, too. Speaker DeLeo has established as priorities education, refunding, health care costs, as we talked about. Also, sports betting and climate change are high on his priority list. Are
Yes.
those priorities of yours as well as they affect Western Mass?
Well, I can tell you that global warming and climate change is a priority of Mike Finn's at this point. He's really, if I may, he's jumped into the deep end of the pool on those issues. He's reached out to officials from the University of Massachusetts. Those issues are front and center. The governor was down in Washington a little less than a month ago talking about climate change. The speaker staked his claim when he offered up a $1 billion 10-year investment for communities who do things that address climate change and green initiatives, and so we'll see how that plays out. That proposal is for capital funds to be authorized and spent. So we know that when we talk about $1 billion, it may or may not be $1 billion out the door. And again, whatever goes out the door, we've got to talk about how we're going to fund it.
And that's called, I think, Greenworks, if I'm not mistaken, the speaker's proposal, like you
Yes.
say, a
Yes.
$1 billion
Yes.
over 10 years. And what will that do? Offer incentives, grants to communities that engage in green energy technology, creating jobs?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Efficiencies, green technology, things that take from rather than add to the carbon footprint. And, so stay tuned. It's ambitious, but I applaud it. Those are front burner issues, and they aren't going away.
And sports betting is another issue that a lot of people are talking about. It's high on the Speaker's priority list. Now that the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down the federal ban on sports betting, even the governor's gotten in on this discussion. I think he's in favor of sports betting.
He's filed a bill.
Yeah, at established gambling areas like casinos. Is that something you can support? Is that something you see happening this year in terms of sports betting across the Commonwealth?
I do see it happening this year. In fact, I think it needs to happen this year, and my recommendation to the Speaker has been that we try to get at this in the first year of a 2-year session. When the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the ban on sports betting, under it's called PASPA, the move immediately was by some states to enact legislation. And my suggestion to the Speaker at that time, I chaired the relevant committee of jurisdiction for that, economic development and emerging technology. So those matters would be before the committee that I had chaired for the last 8 years. And I would expect I would still have a voice in that. But, I said to the Speaker, it's more important to get it right than to do it quickly. And Pennsylvania, for example, moved quickly on a bill, and they set a tax rate of 36%. Well, they're not having, very much success with legalized sports betting because people are still finding their way to the black market. They'll pick up the phone and they'll call a bookie, or they'll go online dealing with offshore entities that we have no idea what the number is. An illegal betting, but estimates are that it's somewhere between $150 billion and $400 billion globally a year. And so I think what it presents for us is that as states around us are doing it and getting into it, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York is looking at it. We need to determine whether it would work for us. The casinos do it already. So, they came to us and said, we do this, we can do this. The problem with having it be only casinos is that you're not going to get somebody from Worcester or, say, the Leominster area to drive to MGM in Springfield, or to drive to Encore, Wynn in Boston and place a bet. So my sense is that we're going to have to allow for things involving technology and the use of mobile devices. And the governor's bill proposes that brick and mortar casinos would do it, but that also the Gaming Commission, which he proposes would have jurisdiction, would be able to license other vendors to engage at daily fantasy sports, DraftKings or FanDuel, for example, if they would want to get into sports betting. And there are obvious issues there about, how much risk you can assume and still manage the movement of money in the form of taking bets and paying wagers. So casinos doing it for a living do that pretty well at this point. And so there is a school of thought that says, well, maybe something like the governor's bill, but where we tie those other entities, which the governor doesn't propose to cap, those third-party entities, make them sub-licensees of casino license holders, and let it play out that way. So those are all the things before us for discussion.
Lots of moving parts.
Yeah, and in fact, there's not a big revenue take, in the eyes of most experts in relation to sports betting. Casinos will tell you that what it does for them is draws more people into their facilities, and that's where they get it.
We're just about a minute and a half away from the end of the show. Time has gone quickly, Joe. But I did want to touch on one other issue. Mayor Koss just announced in Chicopee that he's not seeking re-election. And I'm thinking in my mind, as I recall, you started your political career with Joe Chessy, I believe, 91?
I did.
As an aide for Joe Chessy. Is there anyone in Chicopee asking you if you were interested in running for mayor? Would you be interested in running for mayor after 28 years of going up and down that pike to Boston?
What's interesting is that no one in the media, prior to your just asking me, has asked me, and that's surprised me a little bit. A number of people in the community have asked me about it, and so.
Is it a possibility or a definite no?
Now I feel like I'm on a Sunday morning talk show. It's a definite no.
Definite no. Oh.
You can take it to the bank. I love what I do, and I want to continue to do what I do.
That does it for Connecting Point for March 8th, 2019. Remember, you can find us online anytime at wgby.org/connecting point. Stories will be connecting with you next week.
The element of climbing that hooks people, I think, is the social aspect, and then just the physical and mental challenge of facing your fears and getting up the wall and accomplishing something.
For many of them, it's the criminal justice system that offers the first opportunity to access these medications. So some of them struggle to access this medication through healthcare providers, maybe because of lack of insurance.
The division we were in was the 55-year-old division. So he said, well, we're the Massachusetts speed limits, over 55.
See you back here on Monday at 7 o'clock for those stories and more. I'm Ray Herschel, and have a great weekend.
Support for Connecting Point is provided by our contributing viewers.
I was a highwayman. Along the coach roads I did ride.
This is a great tour. I love working with these guys.
I can't wait to
It's the Highwaymen live in concert next on WGBY. What does the Pioneer Valley taste like? That's a question being explored by James Beard Award-winning chef Sandy D'Amato. As guest chef of this year's WGBY Wine Lovers Dinner on March 16th, D'Amato presents The Edible Footprint of the Pioneer Valley, 7 courses of locally inspired contemporary ethnic dishes. Tickets at wgby.org/wine.
And really your argument is
Jim Madigan epitomized responsible local journalism. It's important to continue his legacy and foster the next generation of journalists.
it's not going to get through the Senate.
Jim valued teaching moments, so the fact that the Jim Madigan Fund will create internships and fellowships is particularly appropriate.
I see public media journalism as vital for our community. I tune in for the news, the debates, and so much more. I want to see this valuable resource be continued.
Ensure the future of public media journalism. Give to the Jim Madigan Fund at wgby.org/Madigan.
What I wanted then is what I want now, freedoms, including fighting for women's rights specifically.
It's about basic human rights issues for the whole of Northern Ireland.
As Bangladeshi women, we are proving to those back home that we can serve the public.
We want our homeland. We want to live free.
Explore the changing role of women in war and peace starting March 25th. Support for WGBY comes from our contributing viewers and by
creating a shared vision for the Springfield region, helping small businesses grow, convening leaders and influencers to get things done. That's the mission of the Springfield Regional Chamber. It's how we drive the economic vitality